Hello, I'm Essie Cupp, and it's an honor to address you today. My job as a CNN host and columnist at the New York Daily News is to offer my opinion about American politics. For nearly 2 decades, that's what I've done in various capacities over multiple administrations. And don't get me wrong, covering American politics is exciting. I've had a seat on the front row of history. The stakes are always high, there are always stories that matter, and it can be a contact sport. Believe me, I know. And it's a full time job, but there are so many stories that don't get as much attention that aren't featured in the steady diet of domestic politics. So, my side hustle has been to tell the often untold stories of what I like to call over there. That's how we describe whatever's happening in the rest of the world, right? Especially in places where the people don't look like us. We say, well, that's happening over there. For me, that's meant traveling to the Maghreb to tell the stories of the Sahrawi people who've been locked in a permanent state of limbo in a sparsely populated, disputed territory in Northwest Africa, or covering the ongoing plight of the Yazidis in Iraq or the Rohingya in Myanmar. And for years, too many of them, in fact, you might have heard me speak about the Syrian war, a genocide of over 500,000 innocent Syrians. Now, that conflict hit me harder than most. I'm a mom, and it's a war that's resulted in the murder of more than 50,000 children, sometimes by gruesome chemical weapons attacks. Thousands more have been tortured or injured by barrel bombs. Many have been imprisoned, never to be heard from again by their families. And countless more are homeless, wandering from camp to camp just to avoid being killed by their own government. Worse, it's unfolded before our very eyes. We are the first generation to watch a genocide happen in real time with a constant stream of video and social media, and we've done shockingly little to stop it. Now, in talking about all of this, I've learned that it's very hard to tell the stories of over there because we are understandably overwhelmed by what's happening right here. There is struggle, trial, injustice, and oppression happening in our own backyards. It's enough to deal with. In fact, it's more than enough. But here's the thing. What happens over there doesn't always stay over there. So when I talk about war or genocide or human rights abuses, terrorism, and other crises abroad, it's often because there are very real consequences for the rest of the world, including the United States. Terrorism outbreaks over there have come to our shores, as we all know. Civil unrest in places like Yemen can have very real national security consequences for us when we pick sides and arm them. There are tangible costs to our involvement or lack of involvement in foreign theaters, billions of our taxpayer dollars that could be well spent or poorly spent either on defense or aid. There are intangible costs to our actions and inactions too. What the United States does about injustices abroad can affect our moral authority and influence to change the world for the better or hold other governments to account. Nowhere is that more evidenced than in the plight of refugees around the world. The story of refugees is not just a story of over there, it's an American story, and one that deeply impacts us. Now, there are good stories, and there are very troubling stories, urgent stories that need our attention. What's happening to some refugee populations around the world is nothing short of tragic. The genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar is just one of those tragic stories. The Rohingya are one of the most persecuted ethnic minorities in the world. More than 900,000 have fled Myanmar to Bangladesh and other neighborhood countries, with untold numbers slaughtered, tortured, and raped. This travesty is ongoing, happening now, as is the displacement of millions of Syrians. The humanitarian concerns there are many. For example, there are currently more Syrians living outside of Syria than inside of it. Many are in refugee camps in Jordan or Turkey with limited resources. Things like food and medical supplies are a daily fight. And for a generation of children, there's been no school for years. To put this in perspective, Sesame Street, the US public television program that entertained and educated so many of us, is creating a new program just for Syria's children to help address the lasting trauma they have been facing for a decade. These children should matter. They deserve our help. Beyond the humanitarian impact of refugee crises, there are national security implications as well. Often, where there are IDPs or internally displaced persons, or where there are refugees, there are dangerous power vacuums that open the door for very bad actors to fill. We ignore those power vacuums at our own peril. Those tragedies are what happens when the world does nothing for refugees. But we also get the good stories, the incredible stories of refugees when we do act. Here in the United States, our long history of welcoming refugees has not only made us who we are, defined our democracy and the American dream, but it's also been really good for us. Don't take my word for it. In a 2019 letter from U.S. generals to the Trump administration on the importance of refugee resettlement, national security, they write that refugee resettlement offers invaluable and concrete support to our allies. Giving safe haven to the most vulnerable refugees, those that can't be safe in their countries, shows our humanitarian leadership. They write that it supports regional stability by preventing a return back to war-torn countries. It bolsters national security missions overseas. And the successful integration of refugees, including those who served along U.S. troops, supports our domestic infrastructure as well. The resettlement of refugees in the United States helps us carry out foreign policy objectives, helps strengthen our intelligence and national security communities too. Refugees are also very good for our economy. They give back. They start working as soon as they can. They pay taxes. They start businesses. They become active members of society. In 2018, the average workforce participation rate among refugees was 81.8%. That's above the national average of 62%. The U.S. refugee and asylee population paid $63 billion more in taxes than they received in government benefits from 2005 to 2014. And they give back in more ways than one. Consider Abdul Hamid, a Rohingya refugee who resettled in the U.S. in 2015. Today, he lives with his wife and children in Milwaukee, where he works as a full-time medical interpreter for the Rohingya and Burmese community at St. Luke's Medical Center. In fact, the U.S. is home to an estimated 176,000 refugee healthcare workers. They are serving on the front lines of COVID as doctors, nurses, and medical personnel. Lubab al-Quraishi trained as a doctor in Iraq. Now she works in northern New Jersey and New York City as a pathology assistant, testing older adults for COVID. Another 175,000 resettled refugees in America work in the food supply chain. In fact, they make up 30% of all workers in South Dakota's meatpacking industry, another important frontline job in the era of COVID. All of these are reasons to help support and invest in refugees. They are our neighbors, and in some cases, they are even our heroes. And yet we're facing the worst refugee crisis in recorded history. An unprecedented 79.5 million people worldwide have been forced from their homes, of which 29.6 million are refugees, half of whom are children. No one wants to be a refugee. It's often the last resort, and the hurdles are immense. To be considered for resettlement, a refugee must receive refugee status by the United Nations Refugee Agency by proving they are fleeing persecution based on their ethnicity, nationality, religion, political opinion, or social group. They must be at risk for further harm and meet additional criteria, like being a survivor of violence or torture. The resettlement program is nothing less than life-saving. Now, it cannot accommodate every refugee, but it must accommodate the most vulnerable, at the very least. Since the creation of the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, the U.S. has set a goal of 95,000 refugees a year. We resettled only 30,000 in 2019, and this year, due to an even lower ceiling of 18,000 and a temporary halt due to COVID, only 7,850 have been resettled. Refugee crisis around the world doesn't stop for a pandemic or politics, it just worsens. Now, here at this Convention on Founding Principles, as we offer a counter vision for conservatives, I'm reminded of why I became a conservative in the first place. Sure, it was taxes and national defense and limited government, but it was also our compassionate conservatism that had offered a beacon of hope for so many around the world. It was the compassionate conservatism that guided Ronald Reagan in his steadfast opposition to communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. It was the compassionate conservatism that guided George H.W. Bush's support of German reunification. It guided George W. Bush in combating AIDS and HIV in Africa. It's in the long-time conservative policies that support Israel, Cuban and Vietnamese refugees, Coptic Christians, and other oppressed, persecuted groups. We are at our best when we are compassionate, especially when it comes to what's happening over there. As conservatives, we are defined not only by the people we stand up against, but the people we stand up for. Marginalizing and demonizing refugees is not conservative. It isn't principled. It's purely political. And it not only hurts refugees, but it hurts America and Americans. The choices are pretty clear. We know what happens when no one stands up for refugees. They suffer, we suffer. And we know what happens when we do stand up for refugees. They thrive, we thrive. So if you can, please take a moment to learn more about the U.S. refugee resettlement policy. Consider supporting tremendous refugee advocates like my friends at Refugees International and inara.org. Your support matters over there and right here. Thank you, and continue to fight the good fight.